I think maybe give it another minute or two. Just people are still coming in pretty consistently. We'll get started in, a minute or so. All right, I feel like we've slowed down with entrance a little bit. Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Broderick. I am the Vice President of Conference Planning, and I have the absolute honor and privilege of introducing Carrie Devlin today. A couple logistical things before I introduce her. Carrie has graciously allowed us to ask some questions at the end of her session. So throughout the session, myself and Audrey are going to be moderating the chat. So if there's a question that you see someone ask that you also really identify with, go ahead and like that question or give it a thumbs up. That way we know the most popular questions. So we will have a limited amount of time at the end and can't answer every question ever. So feel free to use the reactions and the hand gestures and all that fun stuff to clap for her, give thumbs up to a great point, things like that throughout the session. We want this to be as fun and meaningful of an experience as humanly possible for you all. So the other thing to keep in mind is the chat is recorded and is public, will be public on our MAR-AMTA account. So if there's anything that you want to share privately with Carrie, go ahead and do that instead via private message through the Whova app. She will have access to that. You can search her in the contacts and message her directly there. So without further ado, Carrie is the senior music therapist at Johns Hopkins Center for Music and Medicine, where she has the honor of co-constructing music therapy encounters in adult neurology and critical care. She is an adjunct associate professor of music therapy at Shenandoah University, a doctoral student at Aalborg.
You
right?
got it.
Aalborg University, and a very proud dog parent. As a disabled clinician and human, Carrie understands the unique experience of moving through the healthcare system as both a patient and a provider. And I cannot wait to hear what she has to share with us today. Thank you so much for being here.
All right. Hi. I'm really excited to be sharing this space with all of you. I'm going to introduce myself more personally in a minute, but I just want to take a moment to thank you for being here. It's 7 p.m. on a Thursday. My vibes on Thursday night are usually comfy pants, snacks, and doing nothing. I am wearing comfy pants though, and I really hope that you are too. And I'm just really looking forward to sitting in this space with you and hope that while we're talking together, you also find ways to tend to self. Please meet your needs really fluidly while we talk. Get your snack on, grab a fidget, draw, put your comfy pants on if they're not already on. That is a requirement of this presentation. Do whatever makes you feel regulated. And that's particularly important to me because I am going to be sharing some stories from my work in a medical setting and my own lived experiences as a disabled person. And so some of those stories might be a little bit dysregulating, or they might resonate really deeply in ways that could be both really meaningful and also really activating. So I want to start by giving you a brief visual description of myself and the slide. So I am a white woman. I've got my hair up in a bun because I washed it way too close to the start of this presentation and it did not look good. So I put it up. I'm wearing a tie-dye t-shirt that says, "Disabled people are hot," and like a teal blazer, comfy pants, slippers. I wear glasses. And I've got kind of my bookcases behind me that have a whole bunch of stuff on it. And this opening slide has the title of this presentation, that is What Matters to Us, Cripping Music Therapy Values. And it has my name and my credentials, where I work, which is at Johns Hopkins. And it has a really beautiful piece of free disabled clip art from this really awesome collection of stock photos called Disabled in Here. It has both graphic art and stock photos. And this is a picture of 4 disabled folks of color. They're like snuggling in bed together, reading, listening to music on a phone. Somebody has a CPAP like me. Go CPAP users. And this is a piece of art by Jonathan Soren Davidson. And I do want to make just one quick note about language as we're getting started. I did mean to use the word crip. That was very intentional, and I will be using that word throughout this presentation with intentionality. And if you're not familiar with that term, to crip something is to explore it through the lens of disability, justice and disability, culture and pride. So disabled folks might also refer to each other using crip as a term of endearment. So let's get it started. So today, I'm really hoping that we're going to explore these 3 sets of questions that are on this slide. So this is an intention slide, and there are sort of 6 rectangular boxes in different shades of red and purple. And so there's like a question in the top box, and then there's a box beneath it that has a follow-up question. So these questions are, who are we? Who do we want to be? What matters to us, and how might we center CRIP values and rituals in our practice? What evidence are we leaving, and what stays with us? And so this notion of leaving evidence is something that I want to talk with you about today. And it's also my way of honoring some really important disability writings that have impacted me, both personally and professionally. And that includes a quote from the book Crip Kinship that I'm going to share in just a moment. And it's also a way to honor disability justice activist and writer Mia Mingus, whose blog is called Leaving Evidence. So today we have, I don't know, a chunk of time together, 50 more minutes to spend together. And I'm hoping to use that time really fluidly. So that might mean we talk for all 50 minutes if we're vibing and that's where we need to live. Or we might wrap a bit early and have time for some questions and comments. I'm going to kind of just let it ride and see what happens. And I'm going to try, this is important for me to note, I'm going to try not to talk too quickly. That's something that I'm working on, but also I acknowledge that when I get really hype about something, sometimes I start talking more quickly. So I'm going to do my best to be mindful of that for accessibility and processing throughout this presentation, but definitely shout me out, moderators, if I'm just talking way too fast. So on this slide, there is text reading, who are we? And there are these 2 like concentric circles. There's a big dark purple circle and a smaller like light purplish circle. And the big circle has white text that reads we/us. And then the small circle has text that says I/me. And so I'm going to tell you briefly who I am because I didn't really introduce myself. You heard a little bit of my bio, but I want to tell you a little bit more because I think it's really hard to have a conversation about really anything without knowing someone, but particularly talking about disability so that you can understand kind of the lens of my experience and how that influences my worldview as a disabled person, as a human, and as a music therapist. So professionally, I've worked as a music therapist for 10 years, and I've worked in a lot of different places. I started out in the public school system. I worked in a private practice setting where I got to do lots of really cool community-based stuff with disabled and neurodivergent and autistic folks. But for the last 3 years, I've made a really big and kind of unexpected transition for me to working in a medical setting. And what's particularly interesting for me about working in this particular hospital where I do is because it's also where I receive care as a patient. I've presented to the emergency room at this hospital even recently and seen a lot of people that I know and work with. I often see my own providers in hallways or sometimes even following some of the same patients that I am working in neurology. So the longer I work here, the more I've sort of interacted with some of my own providers and even had to switch providers because I've developed relationships with them outside of the context of receiving healthcare. And so I kind of have this experience of moving through the hospital as my patient self and my therapist self. You know, those physical hallways are the same, but my experience walking through them in those different roles is really different. And it's really impossible for me to separate those two experiences. I'm also in hopefully the very last few months of my doctoral work, and I teach a really wonderful group of music therapy students at Shenandoah who promised they would keep the chat and the vibes in the Zoom room very lit today. So thank you, students. I also have a dog who I'm really into, and shout out to the small number of people who have also listed my dog as their interest in the conference app. I was the first one to put it in, and now there is a growing group of us, and it is suggesting a meetup. So shout out to the dog parents and dog people of the world. But you know, I like cold weather. I like going on hikes when I'm able to. I like reading books that aren't textbooks. I like baking gluten-free and dairy-free things. But I also spend a lot of my free time, like most of the disabled folks that I know, like making medical calls, trying to track down prescriptions, trying to send my medical records places, coordinating my own care, and doing all of the things that I need to do to be able to work and to be able to teach and work on my doctoral studies. And so it's like a little bit about some of the different selves and hats that I wear, but it also barely scratches the surface. But in order to have this conversation, I think we have to talk about like meaning I, me, but also you, who are all of you. But I really want to shift that into who are we today? Who are we as a collective of music therapists and humans? And I think it's a really innately human thing to ask these big questions like, who are we? And why are we here? But today I'm really asking us to sit in that space of questioning, but specifically asking those questions in terms of who we are and what we do as music therapists. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about the disabled me, working with the disabled we, the people who I encounter at the hospital who are often newly disabled, or they might be coming to the end of a lifetime of chronic disability or illness, like brain cancer. And so while I'm a healthcare provider, I also see myself quite often and the people that I work with because they are part of the disabled we that I am a part of. They are my disabled kin and they're my fellow community members. But I'm also part of the music therapy we, music therapists. And so I think many of that music therapy many of us are, especially in response to liberation and justice-oriented movements that are really challenging us to unsettle power hierarchies that are kind of traditionally inherent to the therapeutic relationship. I think many of us are beginning to think about our values more often. Our values as people who have intersectional identities that reflect different cultures and ways of being. So like our personal values, but also our values as clinicians, which can be quite disparate depending on who you ask. When we think about all of the different perspectives available to us as clinical practitioners and the tensions that exist within and across those perspectives, and the ways in which they realize the personhood and the agency and the autonomy of therapy participants in different kinds of ways. And so today, what I really want to ask is not who are we right now, but who do we want to be? What are the values and perspectives that we want to embrace, but maybe that we need to embrace and amplify to more fully realize who we want to be? And so on this slide is big text that says what matters to us. And it's a white background because I haven't clicked yet for the big reveal. So when we think about who we are and who we want to be as people and as music therapy clinicians, and how our values intersect with those different ways of being, we also have to start unpacking the different roles that we embody in our work, especially in relation to disabled folks who we might collaborate with in therapy spaces. And so I've just clicked and an animation has popped up. It's two kind of layered purple and light purple rectangles with rounded edges. And so the first one has a citation to Fisher and Leonard, 2022, and it says therapist as savior, semicolon, client as damaged. And then it's kind of moving outward or downward to another set of layered rectangles that say therapist and client as holders. So Sharcarol Fisher and Hakeem Leonard talk a lot about the harm that is inherent to perceiving therapy participants as being damaged. So damaged and in need of a therapist to save and to fix them. So if positioning ourselves as saviors is a value that we are intentionally or unintentionally living, what happens when that is in conflict with what matters to disabled folks that we might be working with? And I mean that both professionally, the disabled colleagues we might be working with, and also therapy participants. What if we start to reconceptualize disability not as damage, but rather as a multiverse of possibility, where disability can be realized in whatever way is meaningful to that disabled person themselves, whether that's neutral perception of their disability, whether that's pride and culture oriented, or whether that's something that's actively in process, or that's a source of curiosity or a source of grief. What if it is all of those things at once? And so when we think about disability as a kind of wholeness, then we can think about disabled therapists and disabled therapy participants as whole. And not only as whole, but as the holders of their own stories and values and perceptions and ways of being. And this goes for disabled music therapy students too, who might really be struggling to move through the expectations that are set for them in terms of completing music therapy curricula. What if we reconceptualize disabled music therapy students as holders of expertise in terms of the skills that they have to offer, in terms of what clinical environments might align best with who they are and what they can offer? And what if we find ways to follow their lead in terms of developing creative workarounds that invite them to practice in ways that are sustainable for their minds and bodies? Even if those ways of practicing differ from maybe how we were taught or from how others approach their work. And so I've just clicked and brought up two more animations. It's really similar layered boxes. And the top one says therapist as expert, semicolon, client as recipient. And that's moving downward into a second set of boxes that says therapist and client as unknowing together. And that is citing Natasha Thomas in 2021. So when we understand the therapist and client as holders of expertise and experience, we are also challenged to shift out of traditional roles that position therapists as experts and participants as recipients of the therapist's expertise. And so that doesn't mean that that's not true at times. I certainly seek out a therapist. When I was looking for a therapist, I sought out someone with a specific kind of expertise. And I think that's an important part of our work. But what if we find ways to acknowledge that we are both holders of stories and experiences, and that we are both holders of expertise, and we work to find ways to honor that expertise in our work? What happens if we shift into this space that Natasha Thomas would call unknowing together, where we honor the expertise that we both hold while simultaneously acknowledging that we do not always have to know the way forward. We don't always have to know where we're going. Sometimes that reveals itself in time. And I think that not knowing is something that disabled people are particularly skilled at, because we've spent often lifetimes existing in spaces of not knowing, in terms of seeking diagnoses, a name for something that we're experiencing in our bodies or our minds. We're seeking healthcare, feeling excluded socially and politically and academically, in community and public and physical spaces. And so in this way, disabled therapy participants are the true experts of sitting in the unknown and allowing the known to construct itself over time and in whatever ways it needs to assemble. So this next slide says, what evidence are we leaving? And it's got a kind of a long quote from the book Crip Kinship by Shada Kafai, and a picture of the cover of that book is also pictured. So I'm going to read the quote in a second. So if we're sitting in the space together of following the lead of disabled folks and thinking about, okay, we're both holders of expertise. We, therapist and client, are both constructing understanding in partnership with each other. by inviting ourselves to sit together in the unknown, then we are creating evidence together in community. We are reimagining ways of being together. We are reimagining our futures together, and we're telling and retelling our stories in relationship. Stories, and I think for us as music therapists, music and the arts are historically for disabled people a powerful form of evidence that we were here in a world that tries really hard to strive toward the erasure of disabled folks. And so I want to read this quote. It says, "It is a profound and transformative act to leave evidence that we existed, that we struggled, and that we thrived. Sometimes we, disabled people, are so erased by intersecting oppressions that regulate our body minds that all we can do to remember that we exist and that we deserve to exist is to leave evidence, to leave proof that we were here. To resist this erasure, we offer body-mind maps of endurance. We offer our stories, our faces, and our histories so that we too can become tangible." So we as music therapists are always receiving and holding, and maybe sometimes even extracting the evidence left by disabled people that we collaborate with in our work. But we are also leaving our own evidence in the ways that we interact with the people that we work with. Is the evidence that we're leaving with people the kind of evidence that reinforces these societal perceptions that strive toward erasure? Are we leaving the kind of evidence that communicates to disabled people that they need to mask or hide aspects of their ways of being? Or are we leaving evidence that affirms identities, ways of being, and that actively seeks to unsettle systems that harm disabled folks? In what ways is the evidence that we're leaving with people tangible? And to whom is it tangible? Who does it stay with? And so disabled folks are very clear about the values and rituals that matter to us. And so today we're going to spend a little bit of time exploring them. I'm going to share a few stories from my own work that I think really embody, at least for me, the ways that those values and rituals kind of move through me and my music and the way that I share space with people. But my intention of doing that is to make them tangible to you so that you might also explore how they might be realized tangibly in your work. And so on this slide, which has a Black background and white text reading CRIP values and rituals, there's a white box, and that has a quote from a digital art installation called #CRIP_ritual. And so the quote defines rituals or CRIP rituals as practices that transform and draw together social worlds. #CRIP_ritual thus describes the things that disabled people do to create new possibilities and realities. And I highly recommend that you check out that website. It's an online art installation, and it's really lovely. And to the right of the quote are 4 colorful boxes. They're orange, pink, teal, and purplish. And each box contains one of 4 values that we're going to spend time talking about. So from top to bottom, those are intimacy, CRIP time, interdependence, and mentorship and care. Water break. So this slide that I've just changed to has a bunch of gray and white and black imagery of brain scans. And so before we move forward and start sharing some stories, it's really important to me to share that the stories I'm going to share with you are fictionalized to protect people's confidentiality. But it's more than that for me. It's more than confidentiality. These encounters were sacred and intimate, and I want to protect the intimacy of what happened in those clinical spaces. And so while I've changed quite a lot about each story, they reflect very real encounters with very real people who have impacted my life and my work, both personally and professionally, in very real ways. And so for context, most of my clinical work now happens within adult neurology and specifically within adult neurocritical care. And so that is a really specific environment where many of the people that I share space with often have experienced a very sudden trauma or a very sudden event, as in they were identified as being healthy and living a regular life, and then suddenly they were not. And that might mean that they've lost a significant amount of functioning. That might mean that they die in a very short period of time. And so part of my role is to provide support both to patients and also to their family members as they are processing what is happening, making sense of the things that medical providers are telling them as they're moving through brain death testing and organ donation and all of those things. So this is a really big, heavy space, and I'm inviting you to step into it with me. And you're going to notice that I'm actually intentionally going to de-emphasize the music in those encounters, because I think we're all really skilled musicians. We know what we're doing musically, but I think sometimes we don't talk enough about what happens outside the music, and how what happens outside the music can be the stuff that stays with people the most. And I know that might feel weird because this is a music therapy conference, but I think the extra musical moments really matter. And so I'm looking forward to emphasizing those for you today. But know that some of the stories I'm going to tell might feel really heavy. So please feel empowered to get up and move, to shake it out if you need to close your eyes and take it in, to feel what you need to feel. So while I'm going to share 3 stories from neurology, I'm also going to share 1 story from my work in pediatrics, in partnership with a really wonderful music therapist who works at Johns Hopkins Children's Center, Jamie. So the first value that I want to talk about is intimacy. So on this slide are 3 bullets and a graphic of 3 interlocking circles in red, teal, and yellow that contain the words in clockwise order: love, grief, and access. So these are 3 forms of intimacy that I really want to talk with you about. But what I really want to do is center the idea of love in therapy. So this happened literally days ago. I'm going to tell you something that I couldn't even believe it as it was happening, because I had already planned these slides and I'd already been thinking a lot about this idea of love. But literally days ago, I was sharing space with a patient who was in a really dark and difficult place. And they were grappling with feeling like a cog in the wheel of the medical industrial complex. And they talked a lot about how, I get it. Medication is important. PT is important. I need to get up and get moving. OT is important. I want my fine motor skills back so I can use my phone again. But they were saying that I've been here for so long in the hospital, and there's been so many attempts to make me feel better, that they were feeling really depleted and undernourished. And they said to me, these doctors are giving me medicine, but I want them to give me love. I want everyone here to love me back to health. I want to be loved back to strength, and I want to be loved back to myself. And that resonated so deeply with me, just as a person, but also my worldview as a human. And it's really kicking it back to some of Mary Priestley's writings. In 1994, Mary Priestley wrote, "As a therapist, I find that love is an essential ingredient of therapy." And this is something I think about a lot. Do you love, or do you allow yourself to love the people that you work with? If so, how is that love expressed? Do you invite people to love you back? Do you love each other like disabled people love each other? Because we're really good at loving each other. I think all of all the relationships in my life, the ones that I share with disabled folks, are some of the most intimate relationships. And I think that's because disability is such an intimate experience. We talk, of course, in therapy about boundaries. And of course, I believe that boundaries are important. But I think sometimes we forget that therapy is an act of care. And it's not a one-way street. It's not therapist loving a client. It's an exchange of love. We as therapists offer people care, but we also receive it in really deeply intimate ways from the people that we share therapy spaces with. So I'm personally not really able to understand therapy in any other way than as a really intimate expression of love and care. But I think we also have to acknowledge the power dynamics that are at play in that exchange, that we have to be attuned to. But if we can start to erode some of those power dynamics, how might that open us to give and receive love and care in ways that reflect the ways that disabled people give and receive love and care to each other? And so I think a central way that disabled people show each other love is through something that Mia Mingus calls access intimacy. So access intimacy is a deep form of understanding in relationship where a disabled person's access needs are fluidly met by someone else without asking, without complaint, but by simply acknowledging what they are and making space for them. So how can we as therapists create space for access intimacy in our work? How can we share access intimacy with the people we work with? And this feels really paramount to me because Mia Mingus wrote that without access intimacy, relationships exist under a glass ceiling or are split by thick frosted windows with huge pieces of ourselves never able to be reached. So how can we learn to meet our own needs while also meeting someone else's needs in a therapy encounter? And I think when we're thinking about love and access, if we are therapists, we work in big spaces with people. And that often means encountering grief in different kinds of ways. And I think that disabled people are some of the most skilled and refined grief workers ever. And I think that's because we have to spend a lot of time grieving. We become experts at grieving ourselves, our lived experiences, and grieving the losses of our disabled kin, of people who die, who are murdered by the healthcare system, and I think by law enforcement. And I think grief is a constant part of our lives. And so it's important to remember that disabled people are allowed to be proud of who we are, while also grieving the pain that comes sometimes with being disabled, and that includes losing people who are important to us. And Leah Lakshmi Piepsna Samarasinya, if you've never read any of their writing, please get to Googling and do so right now. They write a lot about the interplay between intimacy and access and grief. And they talk a lot about how disabled people are leaders in letting each other witness messy grief and being able to hold messy grief for other people. And so for me, this raises questions about how we as therapists are witnessing and holding what therapy participants offer us. Are we inviting this intimacy or are we preventing it? Are we turning away from it? How does our comfort or discomfort with disability in particular shape the kinds of intimacy that can form in our relationships with disabled folks? And so I think for me, being a disabled person has kind of uniquely prepared me to work in the clinical environment that I do and to bear witness to some of the things that I have experienced as part of my work. And so on the screen now is a real picture of the neurocritical care unit where I work at Johns Hopkins, minus a lot of extra equipment. It's a pretty empty room. But I want to take you with me to a day that I had a couple of weeks ago where I met Paula and Dan. So Paula had come to the emergency department 2 nights before I met them. Walked into the emergency room complaining of a headache, or a very bad headache, worst headache of her life, but was walking and talking and making jokes. In the hours from her arrival to the emergency department to the time that I met her family, she was rushed into neurosurgery for what would ultimately become a fatal intracerebral hemorrhage that was caused by a ruptured AVM. It's an arteriovenous malformation. It's like a cluster of blood vessels. So it burst and it caused a massive, an unstoppable amount of bleeding. And she had no idea that she had that. And so when I first met her husband, Dan, I was sent into the room 30 minutes after Paula's first brain death examination. And so when I walked into the room, it was a room like this, but it was very, very dark. There were no lights on. There wasn't a lot of natural light coming in through the window. It was very dark, and it was filled with equipment. It was actually quite hard to maneuver into the room because there was so much equipment. And you could hear the rhythmic kind of in and out of the vent. And her husband, Dan, was sitting at bedside. And when I walked into the room, he was alone, but he was repositioning, I couldn't put a number on it, maybe 10, 15, 20 stuffed animals all around Paula in bed. And so I just sort of stood there in the doorway and watched as he would put a stuffed animal, in the crook of her arm and then say no and move it. And it was this very intimate expression of love and care, like trying to get the just rightness, the just right arrangement meticulously around her. And so that day, that was the way that we started our time together. And I ended up spending about 5 hours with Dan over the course of that workday. I didn't see any other patients or families. That was the only encounter I had that day, kind of spread out across the day. And most of the time we spent together was actually not making music. We did play music together. I learned about Paola's favorite music and we shared some of her favorite songs together. We made a plan for legacy creation, really centering on experiences for their very young child. But that's not really what I remember from this encounter. What I remember is the way that Dan loved on Paola in a way that transcended consciousness and conversation, and that he was so willing to share with me so intimately and vulnerably. I think about him repositioning those stuffed animals. I think about how he asked me if I would just sit with him. He said, I feel connected to you, and I feel like I'm not ready to have other family members here. Will you just sit with me? And I just sat with him in silence for over an hour. We did not speak. I just sat and witnessed. And I think about when I was playing music, instead of singing, I heard him he moved really close to her and he started speaking to her. I couldn't hear what he was saying, and I don't think I was meant to hear, but it was this deeply intimate exchange of love and care. And it was profound to witness. And when I finally left for the day, because I needed to leave to go home, Dan embraced me and he said, "Thank you for inviting me to be my full self today. I just needed to be really messy." And so sitting vigil with Dan over the course of an entire workday really reminded me as a therapist that it is this vital kind of intimacy to hold someone in their grief and for someone to trust you in their grief. But my time with Dan was also an exchange. He held me in his grief. He invited me in. Time was kind of suspended and flexed. I had no sense of how long I was in the room. I had no sense of needing to go somewhere or be somewhere else. I was just there with them. And he just let the space be messy. And it was so intimate. And for me, this was the summation of therapy as an exchange of love and care, and how in the time that Dan and I spent together, we together, without speaking, without a verbal agreement, we created space for access. We fluidly left and went to the bathroom when we needed to, got water, moved, changed positions. We talked sometimes we didn't. Sometimes he cried. And sometimes I was quite tearful, just sharing space in the room with him. And so it was this space that was about grief and love and access with no expectations of doing anything but being together. And so the way that for me time was flexing and bending in this relationship with Dan is a reflection for me of an essential disabled value and ritual called crip time. So this term was coined by Allison Kafer in their book, Feminist Queer Crip. And Kafer talks about crip time as bending the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds. So it's a way of flexing and reconceptualizing our relationship with time and punctuality in ways that align with disabled experiences. And so in the anthology Disability Visibility, which is edited by Alice Wong, Ellen Samuels writes about how crip time is beautiful and forgiving, and how it works to unsettle notions of normality and productivity that don't serve disabled folks. I mean, think about how I spent that day with Dan. It would not, by capitalistic terms, be considered a productive day. For me, I can't imagine anything better that I could have done with my time than be with him as long as he needed me to be there with him. But in many work environments, there are quotas. There is an expectation that we see a certain number of people in a day. And being able to sit with him in this space of time no longer really mattering, it meant something for him. And it also meant something for me. And I think we have to think about how, as clinicians, are we creating space for time to bend when we need it to bend. And so on the screen is a still from the show Top Chef on Bravo. So when I think of bending time, of course, I think of the time that I spent with Dan, but I also think of the time I spent with Gladys. So I met Gladys on the brain rescue unit, where she was recovering from really severe head trauma. And so at that time, she was dealing with significant chronic pain and with aphasia, and she wasn't able to communicate using more than a few words and phrases. And so when I first went to see her, I had a referral from her neurologist. She kind of waved me in the room and then turned back to the TV. she was watching Top Chef. And on the show, they were like about to start a quick fire challenge. And so I started talking to her about who I was and who music there, I was telling her about music therapy, and she shushed me. She raised her hand and went, shh, and waved it in my face and then turned back to the TV. So I sat there and I watched the quick fire with her. It was on for like 20 minutes. And then the episode was getting kind of interesting. So I stayed and I watched the rest. I sat in the room with her for 45 minutes watching a full television episode. I started talking about the show. She was laughing. She tried to comment on, she was trying really hard to tell me that something did not look good to eat. We were kind of like judging the dishes, and we did nothing in our first session but watch 45 minutes of Top Chef. And so the next day when I came by, she was watching HGTV. So we watched the last 10 minutes of an episode of House Hunters and talked about like, how can these people afford these houses in this economy? And so the next show started, and I assumed she was just going to want to keep watching that show. And then she turned to me and said, music. And so we played music. And so this continued for weeks and weeks, where we would like move in and out of watching TV together, and we'd play music together. And gradually her speech started to come back, and she started to open up a lot more about what she was going through. And she told me, I can't believe you stayed and watched that whole episode. No one ever stops and just sits with me. And she said, that's how I felt like I could trust you. And so I really don't think the relationship I had with her would have unfolded in the way that it did and as strongly as it did if I hadn't set my agenda aside and just stayed with her to watch Top Chef. Things needed to unfold in her time. And that really reminded me that being there is the most important thing. It's not really about what you're doing. Sometimes it's really just your presence that matters. And acknowledging that relationships take time to cultivate. We don't deserve people's trust right away just because we're a therapist. It has to be earned in relationship. And everybody's got a different timeline for that. And sometimes that relationship cultivation is not even an active process. Like we might have been taught about rapport building, and sure, that's something you can do. But sometimes it's a process of simply showing up and being there and meeting someone where they are, and maybe watching a little reality TV. And so when we're thinking about honoring individual timelines and people's relationships with times, that's really a form of interdependence, which is a core value of disability justice. And it's really about working together to meet each other's needs, offering and receiving care fluidly, because we all need different kinds of support at different times. And the ways that we can give and receive support to each other can be fluid, and it can be non-transactional. As in, like, disabled people aren't out here keeping receipts of the things that people do for us. Like it's about this exchange of care without expectations of returning that care in the future. And Mia Mingus writes about interdependence, saying it's about solidarity in the best sense of the word. It's about community. And I think this is one of the reasons why it can be so harmful to refer to someone as high or low functioning, because that's a very reductive way to think about access and care and meeting support needs that shift depending on someone's life circumstances, depending on the lighting, depending on how loud the environment is. And embracing interdependence invites us to let go of independence as a gold standard outcome of therapy. And it allows us to decenter capitalistic ideas of independence in relation to our skills and our productivity as workers. And that doesn't mean that it's bad or wrong for somebody to want to be more independent, but interdependence offers another path, a parallel path, something to consider in tandem. And so on this slide is a picture of a guitar, it's like kind of a fancy, I don't know, artsy shot of like the body of a guitar and a person's arm over it. So something that you might not know about me is that I, as a 10-year practitioner, I've been practicing music therapy for 10 years. I can't always meet the required guitar competencies. I'm trained and skilled at guitar. I've been playing and practicing for 12 years, 13 years, but some days I absolutely cannot play bar chords. I know how to play them, but I physically can't play them. And I can't meet the competencies that many of the students I work with are working towards. So on days when my hands aren't able to do those things, I might lose feeling in my hands. I might have pain when I try to play, and that causes me to actually flub chords and strum, and my strumming patterns quite a lot. And it makes me sound like a really novice guitar player, but I like that about myself. That's my aesthetic. That's my disabled musical aesthetic as a musician. And I love that the way I play is spicy, it's unexpected, and it's uniquely mine. And it creates really awesome moments where I flub a chord and then the patient that I'm working with starts laughing and I start laughing, and it's a moment. And so I want to tell you about a time where I was struggling to play bar chords. So at that time I met Malik. He was a 25-year-old professional musician, a guitarist and a music producer who was on the neuro ICU recovering from a stroke. And so he had lost all movement on his right side. And he couldn't yet talk because he was intubated when I first met him, but he was writing guitar on a whiteboard and showing it to hospital staff, which is how I found my way to him. And so when we started talking, it became really clear he was really worried about if he was going to play the guitar again. He expressed a lot of feelings of uselessness, of loss, and fear about his career because playing guitar was his livelihood, but also his joy. And so on the day that I met him, I was having a bad hand day. And I actually disclosed this to Malik. I was like, look, man, you're a good guitarist, so I'm going to be straight with you. I can't play the fancy stuff today. And his face lit up and he wrote on his whiteboard, I fret. And my first thought was, oh no, I've disclosed something about myself and he's worrying about me. But then I realized he was trying to communicate something to me about how we could play the guitar together, that we could embody interdependence in our playing. So I repositioned myself. So he took over doing the chord shapes, and I positioned myself so I could strum the guitar. And we pulled up chord sheets and we played a whole bunch of songs, and it allowed me to play for longer than I could have. And it was a really beautiful moment that I'll never forget, where it was about doing something together in community, and that actually led to a stronger relationship and some pretty creative problem solving. I'm going to try to move. I know I want there to be time for questions and comments, but also I want to make sure I tell you this one last story. So if we're talking about interdependence, it's really also important to talk about the way that disabled people mentor and care for each other. And there's a name for this specific kind of mentorship, and that's when someone positions themselves as a CRIP doula, someone who offers CRIP mentorship to support someone in their transition to disability, in their rebirth as a disabled person, and who welcomes them into the community. And that is a really important transition, because having the support of a community member can help that process be more of a birth than a death. And Hakeem Leonard talks a lot about creating the conditions that people need to thrive in music therapy. And so what conditions are needed for disabled people to thrive, both as music therapists, but also as therapy participants? Well, I can tell you, we need disabled mentors. We need disabled elders working in the field. We need disabled faculty people. We need disabled clinicians who are doing things uniquely and differently and modeling that it's okay to do things differently. We don't all have to play instruments the same way or practice in the same way. And I think that can be so essential to cultivating an ancestry of disabled folks in the music therapy community. And I find myself often working as a CRIP doula in the hospital with people. That's not my official job title. I mean, I think it should definitely be a paid job that exists in all hospitals everywhere. But I find it something that I find myself sliding into much more than I expected. So on the screen is a picture of hands that are cutting like some string. It's a lot of tactile materials. So there's like a binder that has a comb and buttons, tactile things on a felt board. There's pictures of a banana and an apple. And so I received a request from Jamie, the music therapist at Johns Hopkins Children's Center, to come and provide some support to Ren, who was a 3-month-old who had just been diagnosed with a genetic condition that meant that they were going to have low vision and low hearing. And so the referral was to come and support Ren, but to also support Ren's parents, because they were expressing a lot of curiosity about how to engage Ren in music, because they were musicians and they wanted him to be able to experience that and weren't quite sure how that was going to work if he had low vision and low hearing. And so upon meeting Ren and his parents, it was so clear that they had so much curiosity and joy to learn about disability and to find ways for Ren to move through the world that built on their strengths and interests. So we spent our time together brainstorming like multimodal developmental experiences that could be meaningful, like pillows that had a speaker so Ren could feel vibrations, exploring like how Ren could be positioned on a parent's chest so that they could sing and Ren would be able to feel those vibrations, even if he couldn't hear it. And we talked about exploring different textures as a way to regulate and familiarize yourself with the world. And so I worked with Jamie to make a list of toys and sensory tools and writings by deaf-blind folks and lists of tactile sign classes and other resources that we thought would be meaningful to the family. And so their excitement to be welcome to the community in this way and to pave the way for their child to be in the disability community, to find people to connect with who had similar lived experiences. It was truly one of the most cup-filling things that I've ever experienced as a disabled clinician. And it was such a gift to talk with them so openly about disability, both in terms of the realities of that lived experience, but also in affirming ways, just as other people had done for me in my life. And I just wonder how we as music therapists can consider where this mentorship fits, or when we need to recognize that we need to connect someone that we're working with somebody who has that lived experience, who can offer that mentorship to them when they are ready and able to receive it. So our time is coming to a close. So I just want to come back to these questions and just invite us to take a moment to think about what answers are coming up for you after sitting in this space together, and particularly what answers are coming up for you in the context of clinical work with disabled folks in whatever setting our clinical work takes place. So thinking about who are we and who do we want to be? What are our individual and collective identities? How does that impact where we want to go? How can we make space for more disabled music therapists to enter the field and to move through the educational process in ways that emphasize thriving rather than surviving and fitting in? Who do we want to be collectively as music therapists? How do we want to describe our work? What do we want to emphasize in our work? What values matter to us? What values are missing from our work? And how can we create space for those values to be realized? And who can we turn to learn more about those values? And finally, what evidence are we leaving? What evidence is staying with the people that we encounter in our work? What evidence is staying with us? I mean, for me, the evidence that remains for me from Paula and Dan, from Gladys, from Malik, from Ren and his parents is so clear, because they remind me how essential these values of intimacy and interdependence and CRIP time and CRIP mentorship, how essential, how vital they are to me as a person in my life, but also to me as a therapist. And those two things can't be disentangled, because therapist me and person me, we're the same. And so I hope that just sitting in this space together has maybe opened space to consider how some of these values may or may not be realized in your work, and how you might explore integrating them clinically, personally, and professionally. I think we as music therapists, we're always leaving evidence of who we are and what we do and what we believe. And so it's our responsibility to be attuned to that evidence, to be attuned to what mark we are leaving in and on people's lives, and to make sure that that evidence is not in conflict with the stories and rituals and values that disabled people cherish and hold dear. And so I could keep talking about this for hours, but I want to leave space for folks to respond. So I hope that you will reach out and connect with me and leave some evidence with me. I would love to connect with you and reflect with you together on this space. And so on this slide is, of course, a picture of my golden retriever. I can't present without including him in the presentation, but is also my email, which is kdevlin5@jh.edu, and my Instagram handle, which is Liberated Learning. So I would love to keep being in relationship with you. Thank you so much. And I got references, but the slides are also updated if you want them. Thanks for all the love, everybody. The chat was lit. I got to get caught up.
I didn't see very many questions come through. So if you have a question, feel free to circle back to that and, oh, video is not on, and share that question. I will say, I think that 2 times in your presentation that really stood out to people based on the chat reactions was when you said, look at disabled students as the experts, and then also that both therapists and clients are both holders of experiences and expertise, and we need to honor that expertise as clinicians. So those were 2 times that really stood out. And then the other part that oh, okay, there are some questions coming through. So let's see, we can jump to this. Oh my gosh. All right, so there's one question on countertransference. There's a question about mentioning your disability to your clients, and then there's one question about the use of the word CRIP. Do you have any thoughts on which direction you want to go with our 3 minutes that remain?
Can you repeat all 3 choices?
Yeah, mentioning your disability to your patients. The use of countertransference, or how do you encounter and work through countertransference in moments with some of the folks you work with, and then addressing the use of the word CRIP a little bit more.
Yeah, I think I want to start with disclosure, because that is a really nuanced thing. I think we could spend an entire presentation talking about self-disclosure, both as a tool to strengthen relationships, but also as a really important boundary to navigate. I don't disclose to every person that I work with that I'm disabled. It's something that I think happens really, really organically, and is not something that happens every day or even every week or even every month. It's a choice that I get to make as a disabled person to choose when to bring those parts of myself into the space. But sometimes when people, in particular, when people are grappling with a new disability or a new way of having to learn how to move through the world, I have been able to offer my experiences as a disabled person. I'm often wearing hearing aids now. And so I wear them into hospital rooms, and a patient who I was having this conversation about disability with, they were like, "Oh, I thought you were just wearing AirPods." So I said, "No, actually, like, they're hearing aids. Like, I literally cannot hear you without them." And so that was a way for us to strengthen our relationship, where I disclosed that I was wearing them and talked about that, like, segued into a discussion about disability community and about disclosure. And I think it can be a really, really powerful thing, but it's something to also be navigating very fluidly, because it's not always appropriate. Many times it's not appropriate. If someone is deep in their own process and they need to just be held and witnessed, then it's not appropriate to bring ourselves into that. But when it's a clear moment of connection, or where someone is reaching out and seeking that connection and community, that's when I might then shift into that, mode of sharing. But it's a fluid thing. It's something I'm always still exploring, and curious about myself.
Absolutely. And I don't know that maybe we can sneak in a little touch of countertransference.
It does. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a real thing. It's something that I'm always attuned to and making, and that's also part of my disclosure process. I pause and think to myself, what is the reason why I'm choosing to disclose this piece of information about myself? Is it genuinely in service of this person and their process and our relationship, or is it something that I'm doing for me because I feel really connected to this person? And those are 2 very different things. I think for me, the biggest challenge for me in my work in neurology is that a lot of people are grappling with disability as a very painful experience, as something that they do not want to be. And I'm often encountering folks in those really early stages of that process. And I think that's where my work as a grief worker, a steward of grief, and sitting in that space and knowing that, having my own processes and rituals after those sessions to unpack that and create space for me to feel what I need to feel after holding that and sitting in that with someone else. But I think for me, it's just always a reminder that I once felt that way. and I had to be supported through that process, and that was really transformative for me, and that someone else did that for me. Someone else's did that for me and held it for me and sat in the nuance with me. And so that is something that really helps me sort of stay connected to where I want to be located in those encounters.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspective and everything with us today. And for those of you that are interested in hearing more about Carrie and her lived experience, as well as some other amazing music therapists, there is a panel discussion on co-constructing disability research, amplifying lived experiences, from 10 a.m. to 11:40 a.m. tomorrow. And so you can definitely come back for that and get to hear some more awesome insight. I also want to give you guys the code, which I know is an important component in this. So for CMTE, or for continuing ed credits for this presentation, your code I'll drop in the chat as well. It is OAX8X. So I am dropping it in the chat as well. So again, can we give a big virtual round of applause to Carrie for her chat here today? And thank you all so much for coming and joining us. And thank you, Carrie, so much for your insight and for taking the time to share with us for the past hour.
Oh, thank you, everyone. This was really special.
Absolutely.
We love you. Hi,